And so I think it's important for us in America 250 to think back not only on Monticello and on Mount Vernon, but on the many patriots that really literally gave their last penny for us to be free today.
You were listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, this is actually the second episode of a two-part series with Harold Gonzales talking about the history of the South Carolina Navy and its cooperation with the Spanish Navy during the American Revolutionary War. On the previous episode, we had talked about Admiral Gillen, and we had talked about several ships in the South Carolina Navy that were active, but as the British lost at Saratoga and were coming down with massive ships of the line, the South Carolina Navy realized that the ships that they had would probably not be able to match up. And so they sunk several of them, but Admiral Gillen continued on with his cooperation with the Spanish. So take it away, Harold.
Okay, I'm going to just do a quick refresher on Alexander Gillen and what how he came to the United States. He was born in Rotterdam in the Dutch Republic to Scottish parents on August the 13th, 1741. He was educated in London, lived there for a period of time, and became a sea captain. And his first trip to Charleston was on the brigantine Surprise in 1765. While in Charleston, he married Mary Cripps, a widow from Kent living in the city, and then sailed back to England on the brigantine Freemason in 1766, but began a lucrative trade and I assume mercantile business in Charleston, which was called Gillen and Cripps Enterprises, his wife primarily being the source of funds for that business. Okay, so in 1766 he settles down in Charleston, establishes the business, and 10 years later in 1776 he becomes involved in politics. He was a delegate to the Second Provincial Congress of South Carolina in 1775 and 1776, was a member of the First General Assembly in 1776. The local German Fusiliers of Charleston elected him their captain in May of 1775, and 3 years later he was appointed Commodore of the South Carolina State Navy. Now, the interesting thing is, why was he a Commodore with no fleet? And that was because the legislature felt he would have a better bargaining chip to get ships from the French if he had the rank of Commodore. So he was a Commodore with no ships, if you can believe that. The South Carolina, commanded by Gillen, arrived in Havana on January the 12th, 1782. At Havana, he negotiated with the Spanish and provided a force of 8 combat vessels and 12 transport ships to the Spanish. It was a pretty large fleet because the Spanish had 59 transport vessels for the invasion of the Bahamas, with 2,500 Spanish troops and Marines to invade the Bahamas. They sailed on April the 22nd, 1782, and arrived in the New Providence, the Bahamas, on May the 5th, and without firing a shot, they were able to get the British to surrender on May the 8th. So, successful mission pretty quickly, but there were arguments over where was the money, because remember, the Spanish had contracted with Gillen to transport and support the invasion, yet he didn't get any money from the Spanish. So he sailed from the Bahamas to Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, where he found the creditors from the Duke of Luxembourg waiting for him to take over the ship. And much like another famous Revolutionary War hero, General Thomas Sumter, he had to sneak out of town to avoid the creditors, which tended to be something that occurred all too often during the Revolution. Okay? Once he returned to Charleston, he was actually the founder and first president of the Charleston Chamber of Commerce. In 1784, he was elected to the Continental Congress, but did not attend, and 4 years later, he was a delegate to the state convention that ratified the federal Constitution in 1788. He also became the 13th, he was the 13th lieutenant governor of South Carolina and represented the state of South Carolina in the United States House of Representatives until his death in 1794. First child actually died of fever in Charleston and are buried in Charleston. And on February the 10th, 1789, he married Anne Purcell, who was the daughter of the Reverend Henry Purcell, who was the rector of St. Michael's Church in Charleston. So he probably, I would think she was well connected also. So he had a knack for marrying well-connected women, let's put it that way. He served from March the 4th, 1793 until his death on October the 6th, 1794 at his plantation, and he was buried in the family burial ground at Gillen's Retreat, which was at the time in Orangeburg District, Calhoun County, South Carolina, but today is the nearest town is St. Matthews to where he's buried. I'm going to just read to you. I have here the dedication yesterday that they did for Gillen, and when they marked his grave. So I'm going to just read it. It's not very long, but during the Revolutionary War, Alexander Gillen aligned himself with the Patriot cause and in 1778 accepted command of the South Carolina Navy. In 1780, he leased the frigate South Carolina from a French nobleman and sailed from Amsterdam in support of the American war effort. Although the voyage ultimately ended in financial ruin after the ship was captured by the British, Gillen's service to the cause of independence cemented his place in South Carolina history. In addition to his naval service, Gillen served in the South Carolina Provincial Congress, the South Carolina House of Representatives, and the 13th Lieutenant Governor of the state of South Carolina, and later represented South Carolina in the United States House of Representatives until his death in 1794. Now, you may ask, what was the whole capturing the Bahamas that late in the war? What effect did that have on the Treaty of Paris? Well, it really had quite an effect because the Treaty of Paris, of course, which ended the American Revolution, was signed September the 3rd, 1783 by King George and representatives of the United States. In a separate treaty with Spain, the treaties or the territories of East and West Florida, which remember were the 14th and 15th British colonies in the New World, were ceded to Spain without a clear northern boundary, which resulted in a territorial dispute which would only be resolved later by the Treaty of Madrid in 1795. Spain received the islands of Majorca and the Bahamas, Grenada, and Montserrat, which were captured by the French and Spanish, were returned to Britain. So you can see that many of the territorial settlements were not settled until later. Now, Thomas Pinckney, who was a famous South Carolinian, was an American statesman and diplomat, and he was also a military officer. It was Pinckney's treaty, also known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo or the Treaty of Madrid, which was not signed until October 27th, 1795. That is what finally defined the border between the United States and Spanish Florida. But it also, and a lot of people I don't think realize this, guaranteed the United States navigation rights on the Mississippi River. With the agreement, the first phase of the ongoing border dispute between Spain and the United States, the West Florida controversy finally came to a close because they finally established a northern border between West and East Florida and Georgia and the other states that would be formed in that area. Now, it wasn't until 1819 that the Adams-Onis Treaty between the United States and Spain ceded both West Florida and East Florida to the United States. And that's how we ended up with West Florida and East Florida becoming states in the United States, was the Adams-Onis Treaty. But remember, the Spanish still owned the West Bank of the Mississippi. So the Adams-Onis Treaty basically guaranteed the right of passage up the Mississippi. But remember, the United States owned the East Bank of the Mississippi. Spain still owned the West Bank. And that would not be decided until later on in the Mexican-American War and the Alamo and the War of Texas independence. Some of the other interesting facts, if you want to research this, there's a website called The Frigate, South Carolina in the American Revolution, 1778 to 1783, which has not only excellent history, but it also has many of the crew members. Now, what a lot of people don't realize was the most integrated service in the colonial forces were the ships. Many of the ships had mixed African American, both slave and free African Americans as part of their crew. And on that website, you can see the names of all of the African Americans that served in the colonial Navy with Gillen. There's also a book called The Strange Case of the Frigate La Indienne, aka South Carolina, by Mark Lieberman. If you look at the War Revolution roster of South Carolina Patriots website, you can see Gillen, and many of them are annotated there. But the best book that, if you can find it, I think it is on eBay and on Amazon, is Neptune's Militia, the Frigate South Carolina During the American Revolution by James A. Lewis. And all of these, if you want to do more research, are excellent places to go. America 250 Committee is putting a good deal of resources into Gillen's retreat and the land that they have bought. And there will actually be 4 interpretive panels on Gillen and the South Carolina and their actions during the American Revolution. So if you ever get a chance to go down to St. Matthews, and it's well worth the trip back into the backwoods to see his grave, which they have now cleared. And initially, if you look on Find a Grave, the grave was all overgrown. Now there's probably 3 acres surrounding the grave and a parking lot that has been cleared, and there's rocks, so you can actually get to the gravesite easily now, which you couldn't before.
Well, Harold, that is a great bit of South Carolina history and, quite frankly, American history that we don't really talk about. The fact that the South Carolina Navy was the most integrated of the Navy, of the forces in South Carolina. I mean, that in and of itself helps people identify with the American experience in more ways than they probably could before. So thank you so much for sharing that.
I think we as Americans always think that the Patriots, when we think of them, we think of Washington with Mount Vernon, we think of Monticello, and we don't think about the number of Patriots that lost everything to support the war.
That's right.
I mean, as I talked about in the earlier podcasts on Spain, Oliver Pollock, who was the American financier in New Orleans, who actually financed a lot of Galvez's invasion, died penniless in Mississippi because he had used all his resources to support his personal resources to support the war. And so I think it's important for us in America 250 to think back not only on Monticello and on Mount Vernon, but on the many patriots that really literally gave their last penny for us to be free today.
Speaking of that, what does freedom mean to you, Harold?
Probably the easy answer is to do what I want when I want. I always remember the movie The Alamo when Chill Wills says, when Santa Anna supposedly writes the letter to him, and he says, I don't like when anybody tell me what to do and where I can go and where I can't go. And that was good enough for him to fight at the Alamo. And in a lot of respects, I think it's good enough for me.
Well, on that vein, I will say, and I give props to South Carolina again. Bonham was from South Carolina, so the Alamo in Texas really started in South Carolina in many ways. So I think that revolutionary fervor and thought process and thoughts of freedom, I think that played a hand in all of that. So thank you so much for coming with us today and giving us a couple episodes on a part of history that we don't think about, and quite frankly, we probably didn't even know about. So thank you very much, Harold.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.